HanselMinutes.com. It's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman, hosted by Carl Franklin. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 168, recorded live Thursday, June 25th, 2009. Support for Hansel Minutes is provided by Telerik RAD Controls, the most comprehensive suite of components for Windows Forms and ASP.NET web applications. Online at www.telerik.com. And by .NET Developers Journal, the world's leading .NET developer magazine. Online at www.sys-con.com. In this episode, Scott talks with Aaron Bockover of Novell about the Banshee Project.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman, and this is another episode of Hansel Minutes, and today I've got an opportunity to talk to Aaron Bockover. Aaron works for Novell, and he's the founder of the Banshee Project and also the lead maintainer. Banshee is a really interesting project that is written in Mono and runs on, just about every platform that there is. Thanks, Aaron, for chatting with me today.
Sure, thanks for having me.
So what's the story with Banshee?
So Banshee is a project I started, early in 2005. The original goal was just that there was a gap on the Linux desktop that we wanted to fill, namely there wasn't a really good media player. So the original goal was to just develop a media player that was sort of like iTunes, and we were doing this on the Mono platform. So that's just kind of how it evolved, and over time we ended up kind of really growing it into more than just a Linux app.
So 4 or 5 years ago, that's 2005, that's like 50 years ago in internet years. You took a bet on Mono that long ago. So many people ask the question, is Mono ready? Is it ready for prime time? You thought it was ready 5 years ago.
Yes, that's correct. So one of the original goals with Banshee was that we actually wanted to use it as sort of a showcase application for Mono itself. It was a time at Novell when we were writing actually a lot of desktop applications in Mono. So we wrote FSpot as well, which is it's a photo management application, and Tomboy, which is a note-taking application, and you can collaborate with it. And these other projects have grown and evolved in similar fashions as well. And what happened is, as we're developing Banshee and FSpot and Tomboy and Beagle, our search strategy, we're actually finding problems in Mono, and we're fixing problems in Mono. So by way of using Mono at an early age, we're actually helping grow Mono as a platform. So it's a way of seriously dogfooding our platform here. So
okay.
Everything kind of mixes together and grows as one.
So Banshee was kind of a forcing function to push Mono kind of to its limits.
Yeah, correct. For the first couple of years, 2 or 3 years here, we would run into problems all the time where, we might not otherwise run into. So, yeah, we push back on Mono, and Mono pushes back on us, and ultimately we end up with better products all around. There was, for instance, really early on when we were just getting generic support in the C# compiler, the Mono C# compiler. Banshee was actually the first project to actually switch to generics. So we ran into, of course, a bunch of bugs in the compiler interpreting, the C# spec on generics. So we would fix bugs in the compiler, but then the distributions, the Linux distributions that actually shipped the compiler, we couldn't use that. So we had to actually bundle our own compiler as part of the build process for Banshee to sort of bootstrap until the Mono project actually had kind of released those changes into the wild. Yikes.
That's pretty bleeding edge.
So, yeah, but, the end result is the Mono platform at this stage in 2009, especially with the 2.4 release, which is a long-term support release. We have full C#3, with Link and generics and all that good stuff. So we're definitely, it's a real platform that should really be looked at seriously.
Now, a lot of people have probably heard of Mono. Maybe they've read, Miguel's blog, or they've looked at some stuff online. But just to be clear, we should probably talk a little bit about Mono. That people who work on Mono haven't looked at the .NET source code. They're basically doing a complete black box implementation of .NET, reading from the specs. it's a complete reimagination, but it's IL compatible. I mean, I can compile something on Mono on Linux and it'll run on Windows.
Yes, that's correct. And so Mono is a very, very large project, and at the very core is we have implementations of the C# compiler, and then there's an implementation of the JIT and the garbage collector and all that. And of course, that's written in C. And then the third kind of tier that is the core of the Mono project are actually implementations of the class libraries. So, System XML, MS Core Lib, and so on. Those class library implementations are actually written based on the public API. So the actual code underneath between .NET and Mono are completely separate libraries, but they're API compatible. They're ABI compatible. So you can take MSIL code generated by the .NET C# compiler CSC, and you can run it on Mono, and vice versa.
Okay, so that means if I use system.io.file, no matter whether I do it on Windows and our .NET compiler and on Mono's and yours, when it all gets linked up, it's gonna work.
Correct. It'll work on either platform.
Okay, and this is interesting because talking about this will get us into some of the challenges that you got into on Banshee. So I did this article a long, long time ago that we called The Myth of .NET Purity. This was back when Sun had started their 100% Java thing, and they were saying, are you 100% Java? Is your code 100% pure Java? And it was kind of a reminder. The article was meant to be a reminder that at some point, somebody's going to get onto the metal. Someone's going to call load library, and someone's going to call C code. That pure managed code is kind of a myth. With all of these libraries, you may be calling system.io.file, but someone's going to call some low-level C runtime function that's going to, get down on the metal. Does that mean that in Mono there are two implementations of system.io.file, one for three actually, one for Mac and one for Linux and one for Windows that actually do the work of opening the file?
Yes, that's correct. So there's a couple different things to look at here. One is the actual .NET library, so system.io, for instance. It has to obviously be compatible function-wise. If there are any bugs, which, of course there aren't, if there are any bugs in Microsoft's implementation, we have to be bug-for-bug compatible.
Mm.
So if there's a code path that you hit in a .NET API that isn't optimal, then we sort of have to take that hit as well to ensure that we stay compatible. So that being said, and I'll use System.io as a great example. When you use the System.io APIs on Linux or on a POSIX operating system, so this means the Mac as well or a BSD, you actually incur a little bit of a performance hit when you use these APIs. Some of that's related to sort of workarounds and compatibilities that have to be met on the underlying implementation in Mono, and some of that's because there are pieces of the System.io API that don't really make sense. They're not really conducive to performance. One of these examples is, say, the get files method on System.io directory. Mm-hmm. It returns an array instead of being IEnumerable. So what happens if you're walking a large directory, and we ran into this specifically in Banshee where we would crawl your media directory recursively to look for files to load. We would have to walk the directory, but you couldn't act on any of those files until the actual directory recursion was complete because the array had to be created and then returned. So you end up with a lot of stack and heap overhead there, but you also can't act on what you're looking for until that array is created. So,
wow, that sucks.
So yeah, we have, that's a problem on .NET, but it also, by extension, is a problem on Mono to be compatible.
Right,
so
right.
The Mono project has implemented tons and tons and tons of extra libraries that work on both Mono and .NET. There's a layer called mono.unix and mono.posix, which is a separate API that sort of allows you to work around these problems. So there's and this isn't exactly the right API name, but there's a mono.posix.io, for instance, with an API similar to the System.io API, but it provides a get files method that uses IEnumerable instead, and does things like yield. Yield returns files as they're walked. So that implementation is allowed to use the direct POSIX IO API, the C API, which is much, much faster than the sort of safe and compatible implementation inside of system.io. So the way this is kind of architected in Banshee is we have an actual IO abstraction layer, and the default implementation of that abstraction uses system.io. So that implementation will work. It's functionally correct on all platforms, be it Windows, Mac, or Linux. But if we detect that you're running on a POSIX-compatible system, we load our POSIX IO backend instead, and that backend implements our abstracted IO API using the mono POSIX implementation. So we end up actually performing better in a lot of IO cases on Linux than we do on Windows.
Interesting, and that kind of it's a perfect example of the myth of purity, in the sense that here's an application that you write once and basically debug everywhere. Right.
So I mean, that's just a small example. We have similar abstractions for hardware, for integration into desktop environments. So, for example, in GNOME, a desktop environment for Linux, there's an API that we can use to inhibit the screensaver when you're playing video in full screen. But of course, that API doesn't exist on Windows or on Mac. So we have a few layers. That we have a hardware layer, and these are abstractions. So you would implement a hardware backend for Mac, a hardware backend for Linux, and one for Windows. And then we have platform abstraction layers where you implement sort of specific things for desktop environments or the operating system. So we would implement the screensaver thing for Windows, Mac, and Linux. And these are all actually mono add-in extensions. So everything is fully dynamic. None of this non-core code is actually compiled into Banshee itself. They're all written as separate assemblies or extensions that load in at runtime based on the environment and the actual startup profile for Banshee.
Nice. So this is nice. So this is moving really beyond the old style of things that we used to do in Java, when we would say, basically have a big switch statement, and if on Macintosh do this, else do that. You've really pulled that stuff out, and you pointed out mono.add-ins, which is a plug-in model that came before MEF, the Managed Extensibility Framework, which I think now is open source and is something that Mono could potentially use if you wanted to, right?
Correct. So mono add-ins has been around for a couple of years, and the idea was just that you define extension points, which are APIs. They could be interfaces, or they could be, sort of factory classes. And then you define add-ins that implement certain extension points. And at runtime, mono add-ins sort of reflects over any assemblies you give it, and it looks for these resource files, they're basically XML files that describe whether a certain class in that extension extends any extension point defined in the core application. Of course, reflecting can be very slow. So mono add-ins on the first run, it will reflect the assemblies, but it also creates a binary database of the extension points or the extensions and the extension points that should sort of mix in that environment, so that on a subsequent run, or until any of the assemblies change, it's not reflecting again. So it's very, very fast, at least on the second startup.
Okay, so it's a little jitter there to make those extension points.
Correct, and depending on the build environment, or if we're shipping a runtime build, if we're not shipping a debug build, for instance, we can actually generate that extension database ahead of time, because we can guarantee that the assemblies aren't going to change for a given release, so that if you're not in a debug environment, you won't actually incur that startup cost on the first run.
Okay.
But MEF came around fairly recently. I guess within the last year, we've heard a lot of MEF noise, and it became open source, which is fantastic. And mono add-ins, they're very similar, but I think, and I haven't looked into MEF too extensively, but I think mono add-ins is probably a little more detailed. In fact, one of the proposals is to rebase mono add-ins on MEF itself. So MEF is a little more low level. It does a lot of the same things ultimately, but what Mono add-ins provides is a greater sort of description model of your extensions. So you can ultimately achieve the same thing with both frameworks, but it'd be really interesting to see Mono add-ins actually rebased on top of MEF. And of course, Mono add-ins itself runs on all the platforms. So you can use Mono add-ins with just your regular .NET application. You're not actually tied to Mono here. You could, you load the Mono add-ins assemblies in Visual Studio, and you just start using the APIs, and you distribute those assemblies with your application, which of course are MIT X11 license, which is very similar to the new MSPL from Microsoft. So there's no worry of distribution problems here.
Okay, so just to make sure that we're clear, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that this means that a Windows developer using Visual Studio might want to bring in mono.something, one of those namespaces, because it provides actual functionality. They wouldn't necessarily be using mono in the sense that the runtime isn't mono, but they could definitely look at those libraries if they provided value to them. Correct.
Absolutely. And there's, we have dozens of sort of add-on libraries that kind of just belong under the Mono project as a giant umbrella, but aren't, specifically related to Mono as a platform. Another example is another library I maintain called Mono ZeroConf, and it's an API that's built on Mono add-ins as well, that implements the Bonjour or ZeroConf API from Apple. And on Windows, It uses the actual C library from Apple called Bonjour. But on Linux, it uses another platform called Avahi, which is just kind of a completely separate MDNS SD implementation. But it allows basically an application to use a single API regardless of the underlying ZeroConf platform on a given system. So on Mac and Windows, it uses the same library. On Linux, it can use the actual Bonjour library as well, or a separate platform, the Avahi platform. So we have lots of umbrella projects like that.
Okay, and just to be clear to those listeners who don't necessarily speak English, ZeroConf means zero configuration, right?
Right. It's a broadcast networking protocol. So it allows devices on a local network, to discover each other without actually knowing in advance IP addresses and so on. So, for instance, you can locate printers or SSH servers and so on a given network. I wrote Mono ZeroConf because we needed to work with iTunes' digital audio sharing protocol. And that's the discovery mechanism underneath there. So you can see in Banshee, you can see all the iTunes shares.
Very cool. Now, you can play videos too, right?
Correct. As of our latest sort of generation of Banshee, we support videos. Banshee's gone through, it's about 3 generations, I guess, where we've had 2 pretty complete refactoring and rewrites. And the second one, the goal was to use Mono add-ins and be completely modular. So, only the core part of Banshee is written in pure C# and will run anywhere. Anywhere there's we would introduce or need for performance reasons or for to improve the user experience, we always abstract something so that we can implement the best use of the actual user's resources on a given system. And so one of those add-ins is actually video support. We use the GStreamer backend, hopefully universally. We're trying to use GStreamer everywhere because GStreamer now runs on Windows, Linux, or Mac. And GStreamer itself is plugin based, so it uses, for instance, Direct Show and DirectX on Windows to do video rendering and audio playback. It uses the core audio, core video support in OS X to do video rendering and playback. And then it uses whatever is available on Linux, be it OpenGL rendering or rendering straight to the X server or whatnot.
No, and that GStreamer is written in C, though.
Yes, GStreamer is a C library. Actually, the only piece of Banshee that's not written in C# right now is our media pipeline API, which actually integrates with GStreamer. It's a small amount of C. It's probably around 3,000 lines of C code that we then we p-invoke into from our abstracted media player API.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman with a word from our sponsor. Do you know how to build Web 2.0 AJAX applications with Web 1.0 components? You really can't. If you want to do the next generation web applications, you'll need next generation components, just like the ones that our friends at Telerik have got. They're RAD controls for ASP.NET Ajax. It's a huge pack of web controls built on top of ASP.NET Ajax that'll add previously impossible performance and interactivity to your next project. The new controls mirror the Ajax API from ASP.NET, so development is really straightforward. The client scripts are shared, so loading time is not a problem. If you just set a couple of properties, and you'll be able to automatically bind to web services for a really efficient operation. The new RAD editor from ASP.NET Ajax Telerik loads up to 4 times faster than before, and the new RAD grid handles thousands of records in just milliseconds. But as always, it's best to try for yourself. So you can visit telerik.com/ASP.NET Ajax and download a trial. Thanks a lot. Okay, and this is the part that I wanted to understand the most, and forgive my ignorance, but so there's a GStreamer C implementation. There's a GStreamer implementation that is available for each of these different platforms. It's not the same binary, right?
Right, it's not the same binary.
Okay.
Because at this level, we're at C, so it has to be compiled for each given architecture and platform.
Right, so I want to be clear for our listeners. There's 3 or 4 different implementations of GStreamer, and kind of thinking about things in terms of the way I always think about it, is in terms of the left hand and the right hand. In this case, you might have a version of GStreamer for Windows, and the right hand is talking to Direct Show, but the left hand looks exactly the same as the GStreamer API for Mac or for Linux.
Right. So GStreamer itself is sort of written in a similar way, only it's written in C. It's written in a similar way as in terms of its abstraction as Banshee, for instance, in that it has its own internal plugin model. So all the core GStreamer stuff, there's only one implementation. It's written in C, and it can be compiled on any platform and architecture. But the actual plugins, the plugin that provides video rendering on Windows or audio rendering on the Mac, they're specific implementations to that platform.
Right, exactly. Okay, so then with GStreamer, then you have a p-invoke into GStreamer, and you have structures that are handling that marshalling and that are GStreamer specific managed structures, and then you talk to those. Right.
So at the Banshee level, we only talk to GStreamer in terms of the common API, and there are a couple of very small cases where we don't do that, where we know that an optimal path on Windows is going to be to go ahead and just load the Direct Show plugins instead of trying to search for them in a registry to figure out which is the best one. Because on Linux, there are a number of options that could be the right path, but on Windows, there's only one. So if we detect in libbanshee, the actual underlying C library for Banshee, if we detect that we're on Windows, then we don't do the kind of dynamic registry loading thing. We instead just directly create these Direct Show elements for the pipeline. So we have some cases where we will definitely optimize code paths for the given platform just for pure performance reasons.
Can you talk a little bit about where you hide those things? Because whenever I hear when we detect that we're on Windows or when we notice we're on a Mac, I kind of remember some of the horrible sins that I committed in Java, detecting where I was when I wasn't supposed to be knowing these things. At what layer of abstraction do you bury all of this, if on the Mac, if on Windows? Is this code, or is this in the mono add-ins XML files? Where do you hide that?
Most of the time, and in the best cases, and we've kind of diverged a little bit from .NET here talking about GStreamer, so let me kind of circle back around.
Okay.
If most of the time, it's actually just in the solution file, the Visual Studio solution file. And I should mention, we use the actual SLN and CS proj files to build all of Banshee. So the project builds with F5 on Linux using MonoDevelop, the IDE that's very much like Visual Studio, that runs on, actually now it as well runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. But it supports, Visual Studio 2005, 8, and 10 solution and CS proj files. So
cool.
If you run on Linux, if you F5 on Linux in MonoDevelop, the actual MS build conditions and so on fulfill that platform detection. So basically, if we say that a given add-in or assembly is specific to Windows, then that never even gets built on Linux or Mac. But if we open the solution file in Visual Studio on Windows, then the MS Build conditions will pick all the assemblies or projects that will build only for Windows. So it'll build the core, which builds everywhere, and then it'll build any specific platform extensions to Windows. So at the ideal level, it's all just taken care of by way of MS Build.
Okay.
And then there are some cases inside of the core that we do know for sure that, on Windows, this is definitely an optimal path, or we don't need to do this, and we can just use the system.environment like system environment platform or something, and that's just an enum to tell you which platform you're running on. And so that's perfectly valid. It works on Windows, it works on Mono, and so on. But there's very, very few uses of that in our code. We try not to do any platform detection at runtime unless it's, a super critical code path that we know we can optimize safely.
So does this mean that there's a Banshee.exe kind of, the ultimate build artifact that is specific to each platform? Yes,
that can be the case. We don't recommend copying the core assemblies for like a Linux build. Well, actually, it depends.
So what I'm trying to ask is that, is it a reasonable dream to have one build that produces one artifact that works everywhere? Because I think that Banshee is probably the best example of a .NET application that can run on a half dozen Linux implementations, Mac and Windows. And if a listener is going to think about doing this, should they just prepare themselves now to have conditional builds like you've got, or should they aim for some magical foo.exe that'll do it all?
No, so even the Windows, for instance, I'll use the Windows extensions as an example. They would build on Linux or Mac because it's just managed code. But at runtime, they might crash because they expect something or some service provided by Windows to be there.
Of course,
so it's not so much about adapting your code to do certain things based on the platform you're running on. When you're using a proper kind of abstraction layer that Mono Add-ins provides, it's more about picking the right assemblies that are going to be in that directory on a given platform you run on.
I see. Okay, so as long as you've got the interfacing lined up the way that you want, it's just the couple of platform-specific DLLs that you need to be aware of, and as long as they're ready at the time at runtime, then you'll be okay.
Right. So, and then there's the MS Build optimization where it's if we're creating a build on Linux, don't even try to build the Windows ones because you're not going to use them. That being said, as part of our actual release process, when we do a public release and we create the DMG file for Mac and we create the RPMs and the tarballs for Linux, we actually run the build on all those on those separate machines, so that you get you don't have to worry about it at release time when you just download a release from the website. You download the DMG and it's just what we need to give you on the Mac. You install the RPM and it's just what you get on Linux.
Okay, so you build a DMG on a Mac for Macs, and you build an RPM on Linux for Linux.
Correct. So I should say that we have not actually made an official release on Windows yet, but it absolutely builds and runs, and we're just polishing a few things up, and hopefully before the end of the summer we'll finally have an officially sanctioned and stable release out for Windows. So if anyone's interested in helping out on the Windows port, I shouldn't call it a port because it's the same code, but on the Windows release, then they should definitely get in touch with us.
Now, I know that you're not a fan of living and working in the Windows world, so definitely if someone has some expertise in this area that might want to jump in and help you out, that would keep you off of Windows, right? And that would be a good thing.
Well, I'm not opposed to Windows. I just, my environment is Linux. And in fact, that's what made the reason why we got the OS X port out first was just because it was a more familiar environment for us.
Right.
So, I'm running Windows right now, but...
oh, you are? Okay, I'm sorry.
But, it's a little foreign in terms of, search paths and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, totally.
So any help from the Windows world is much appreciated. We'd love to have more Windows users actively involved in the community.
Well, I think that when this thing comes out, when you get your actual official binary release on Windows, I think that's going to be pretty amazing. Because to be clear, the OS X people, they don't really know. I guess most end users don't realize this is .NET/mono. That's really significant.
Yeah, I mean, that's, it's sort of a goal, is you really want to focus on the user experience and the application and not really burden the user with what's running underneath it.
So you're the official media player of a number of Linux distributions, is that correct?
Correct.
And so there are a number of mono applications that have made their way onto Linux distributions such that they run and they look and they act like any other application, and that really no one who doesn't care has any idea that it's happening. So that sounds like a pretty achieved goal. That's a pretty good thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's at this point there's very widespread mono adoption, and, not just in the Linux sector, but in a lot of other places too. You probably want to talk to Miguel more specifically about that kind of adoption, but it's definitely grown, and it's only getting bigger.
So if people can get their brains, or if our listeners can get their brains around that, and all the kind of the plug-in and the hardware abstraction layers that you've achieved in Banshee, on top of all of that, and being a really awesome media player, and I think you said it was the first media player that works with the G1 phone.
Right. So I just implemented hardware support for the G1, so that if you, for instance, use the Amazon MP3 store on your phone and you purchase music, Banshee will detect that you have actually purchased music, and it'll allow you to sort of integrate that into your library, and you can sync across it just like with iPods. So we support iPods and MTP, like the place for shore devices, which I think now is that spec is called something about Vista, but we work with those devices as well.
So, but on top of all of this, you also have scripting support that you originally did in Boo. Right.
So actually, this is kind of an interesting story how this evolved. Boo, which is it's not quite dynamic, but it allows you to run code at runtime. But it's a language that's very similar to Python, and it works on .NET, it works on Mono, and I think 2 years ago, maybe, I tried adding Boo support to Banshee with the idea that you could write plugins in C# and compile them, they load in Banshee. But I wanted to be able to actually use our internal APIs at runtime just by typing a little bit of code. And what I found was that I was able to easily integrate Boo, but a lot of our APIs were very, very internal, in that they didn't really make sense unless you were you're actually hacking or writing code in the context of the entire application. So it was very difficult to actually get little things done without having to go into the core and make changes. So integrating Boo actually led to this major refactoring with mono add-ins, and kind of put us in the mindset that any API we write, it needs to make sense, it needs to work well with others, and that's sort of, when you go through that kind of evolution of an application, you end up with an app that is sort of automatically scriptable because the APIs make sense. So with the rewrite, we wrote a Boo extension. In fact, Boo support for Banshee is actually provided and hosted in an extension that extends the core. So it's not actually there in the default core application, but it's provided as an extension. And anything that loads into memory in the process can actually execute against any of the APIs in the app domain. So by loading Boo into the add-in, which in turn gets loaded into Banshee itself, any Boo script that a user writes or is executed can pretty much do anything and has all the power that any of Banshee's core or add-ins does as well.
Can that be dangerous at all? Can you hurt yourself with an evil Boo script?
Sure, you can. I mean, you have the power of the application at your fingertips. You have access to all the APIs. So certainly this isn't something that you would want to execute based on untrusted code from, say, online. But yeah, I mean, it's a very powerful mechanism to allow you to extend applications without having to get into like the build environment and so on. You can just pretty much execute arbitrary code by plopping a file on the disk.
So if I put a whatever.boo file in my Banshee scripts folder, and it doesn't compile, what's the experience like? I mean, I don't have IntelliSense. It's all very dynamic. It's just a text file in a folder. How do I write this? I mean, how do I debug this? Just keep trying?
Well, there's two things. One, if it doesn't load, you'll see Banshee will print out the actual compiler error to the terminal, to the console. So the idea is that if you're writing a Boo script if you know you want to script your Banshee, you should probably be running from a console while you're developing that script. So that's where the error message goes, and it'll be able to tell you, this API doesn't exist at this line in your Boo script, and so you go back and fix it. It's just like any normal code writing process that you might go through. The difference is you don't need to worry about the build overhead and all that kind of stuff. So you can sit down at a machine that has Banshee installed by default, and it's just there, but you don't have the ability to compile anything, or you don't have MonoDevelop installed, so you can't bootstrap the project and build it yourself. You're just running the system version, and you'll still be able to actually extend it just by writing the script. Now, if you really get into it and you do have that build environment, you can actually, because MonoDevelop supports Boo as well, it supports the syntax, and then it can do the IntelliSense. If you load the assemblies, the Banshee assemblies, into the MonoDevelop project, then as you're typing Boo code, it can actually do the IntelliSense against the Banshee API. So you can develop scripts, even if you don't know, I guess, the APIs as well as we do. And then, of course, we have API documentation as well that you can look at. The documentation is there so you can see the API structures, but we don't have a lot of actual comments in the documentation yet, which is another thing that we would love community help for.
Now, you've also got support for the DLR, is that correct?
Correct. So Microsoft now has the Dynamic Language Runtime, which runs now it runs flawlessly on the latest version of the Mono Runtime, the 2.4 version, and the DLR allows us to execute a number of languages, not just Boo. So the DLR supports Ruby and Python, for instance. So Banshee users can now extend Banshee using Python or Ruby as well. The DLR extension is not yet in our main Git branch, so because I'm still hacking on it, but it does work, and it's actually a much nicer experience than Boo, simply because you can use languages that are more familiar. While Boo is easy to pick up, especially if you know Python, it's still not Python. It's very Python inspired, but I think working in Ruby or Python itself is actually a much better user experience. And I think there's even an effort, or at least there was, to actually rebase the core of Boo on top of DLR, so you actually get the Boo language but running on the DLR.
So with the scripting support, they've got the ability to do anything that they want to. I mean, I suppose that they're limited only by their imagination, but what might I want to do to a media player? Why would I want to script a media player? Do you have any examples of the kind of things that I would do?
So one of the first things that we had a script for was, so in the Linux world, you've got a lot of kind of old school Unix guys who, they don't like spaces in their file names, they don't like uppercase letters, and this kind of stuff. But we're trying to cater more to end users, and sort of be platform agnostic. So we don't want to assume that we have a bunch of Windows users. We don't want to assume they're all Linux users or Mac users. We want things to make sense. So in the preferences dialog, you can choose how you want your media library on disk to be laid out. So you can say that I want my folder should be artist/album name / and then the file name should be track number - track title .file extension.
Right, it's something people are very passionate about.
Yes, there are definitely people passionate about the way their library is laid out on disk. So we allow you to configure that, but we don't allow in the UI super complicated patterns, because we don't want to clutter or confuse the actual UI. So we define 6 or 7 sensible and common file or directory layouts, and we define a handful of file name layouts as well. So there's just a drop down you can choose. If you go in and you edit the actual config file, you can actually change the pattern yourself by hand. So it's just an expression that expands against a given track. So you can enter arbitrary data, and Banshee will fill that out for you. But what we had was users who weren't even satisfied with the ability to control the path layout by hand, in that they didn't like spaces and they didn't like uppercase letters and so on. So you can write a Boo script that actually hooks into the path formatting API, and it runs these hooks that you can then define in your script. So you can basically give it a regular expression to run against the full path when it's done, or components of the path. So you can choose, they specify the exact pattern they want with, timestamps or any arbitrary data that you can pull from the database. Anything that's in the Banshee database, you could put into this file name. But then they run an expression on it that says translate all the lowercase or uppercase letters to lowercase, change spaces to dashes, and so on. So that was like one of the first examples of a script where we had these diehard Unix guys who weren't happy with the way their files looked, but I wasn't about to disrupt the UI for 0.005% of our user base. So right. They were happy with the script.
But you shut up 0.05% of your user base by giving them the ability to script it. So now they can do anything that they want to.
Right. So the scripting is definitely for power users, but it's for, I like to think of it as a user feature for power users, but also as a way of getting new contributors who are otherwise kind of it's a daunting process to them to actually get the whole build environment set up. So it's a way that you can sort of get your feet wet with both just learning code and then actually see it happen in real life. And also, if you want to start contributing to the project, it's an easy way to get started.
Very cool.
So it's kind of a segue into the real hardcore, programming, but it's also a user feature for these really diehard, power users.
Cool. So I think a lot of the listeners are Windows folks, and it sounds like you're going to have a Windows version towards the end of the summer. And as we said before, if people are interested, they can find you at abock.org, abock.org, and they can find the Banshee Project at banshee-project.org, and I'll have links to all of that in the show notes. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and help me understand how to make cross-platform applications with Mono, and Banshee is a really great example of that.
Great. I'm really pleased that you had me.
Cool. Well, this has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.